Hi, everyone. It's The Takeaway Live, and we are coming to you from WNYC's The Green Space. We're broadcasting today in front of a live studio audience. What's up, New York City? We've got a lot of loyal New York listeners in the house today. This is my hometown. I appreciate y'all showing up. Thank you so much. We have a lot more of you listening from your hometown or your city, and we want to welcome you all as well. So it's exactly 1 year ago today that my voice hit the airwaves for the very first time as host of this amazing show, The Takeaway. Ah, the United States of America, land of the free, home of the brave, and lots and lots and lots of opinions on what it means to actually be an American. So, who am I? I'm Tanzina Vega. When I first sat in the host chair behind the mic a year ago, I outlined some of the gaps that I saw in this country that I felt had to be a part of the core mission of this show. These would become how we began to frame many of the issues that we cover here on The Takeaway. And let me tell you, this year we've covered a lot of ground. But the three gaps that are most concerning to me are the following. Number one, the wealth gap. What that means is why some Americans are way more financially secure than others. Number two, the truth gap. Why we seem to have lost sight of the difference between opinion and fact. And number three, the empathy gap. Empathy gap? Yeah. Why do we seem to care more about the suffering of some people rather than others? You see, these three gaps have gotten us to a challenging, and some people would even call it unprecedented moment in U.S. history. So let's talk about how much progress we've made or haven't made in these three areas. And we're going to start with empathy, okay? And just so we're all on the same page, here's how Dr. Sarah Conrath, who's an associate professor at Indiana University, describes empathy.
So emotionally, we feel empathy when we feel compassion and concern for others. And cognitively, we have empathy when we imagine their perspectives.
So the empathy gap that I'm describing exists when we can't or choose not to imagine the perspectives of other people. And so my question for this panel is, how do we start to close that gap? And I've got three guests on stage with me now who are all thinking about this issue in different ways. Jelani Cobb is a staff writer for The New Yorker who writes about race, politics, history, and culture. Jelani, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Javier Zamora is a poet and writer born in El Salvador and the author of the upcoming poetry collection, Unaccompanied. Javier, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And Ziwe Fumudoh is a comedian and writer for Showtime's Desus and Mero. Thank you for being with us, Ziwe.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so Jelani, we'll start with you. We heard from at the top from Dr. Sarah Conrath. She shows, and her research shows, that our empathy is declining. Mm-hmm. What's happening?
I mean, I think it's a very obvious symptom of the time that we're existing in right now. I mean, just yesterday we saw the president tweeting in defense of people who'd been removed from social media for their belligerence. And I think that what has happened is that we've been kind of in a moment where we've been sold the idea of a zero-sum assessment of everything around us. If you get something, it means that I don't. And what's created is an inability to have the kind of civic bond or civic connection that's fundamental to democracy. So all the things that we talk about, all the institutions and the Constitution and all these other kind of things, they begin with a fundamental presumption that you can see the interests of the other person in yourself. And you go back to the founders, and these are the same questions that they're asking. And so that's something that we're not doing very much of at this moment. I think it comes from the top, and at the same time, it's in some ways too easy to blame it on one person. That what we're seeing in the politics, of our politics now, is the culmination of processes that have been going on for years and years and years and years. And I think that this has been the kind of logical extension of them.
I'd love to hear also from Ziwe and Javier, like as a collective or as individuals here in this country, where is our empathy in this moment? Where do you see where the country stands, Javier?
I like going back to the definition, the focus on imagination. I think we ran out of imagination. I think we're just stuck into the same rhetoric and the same sorts of solutions. I think we need to think outside of the box, and I think we're not doing enough of it.
Ziwe, where do you think we are today?
With empathy, horrible.
Tell me how you really feel.
Well, I think it speaks to the zero-sum game you refer to. Well, I see someone existing and there's widespread corruption. He gets whatever he wants. He doesn't have to break the rules, or he doesn't have to follow the rules. And so as an individual, you see someone succeeding, not following the rules, and you think, well, I don't have to follow the rules either. And then you have all these silos of people just being very selfish. And that's at the crux of empathy. It's horrible. Everyone should be kinder.
Yeah. But there's also an idea that if I get something, what you were saying, then everybody else can. There's this selfishness that's happening. And as an immigrant, I think that's where immigration goes into it. We can't all have it all because these immigrants are coming in and taking everything away from us.
Absolutely. It's an overarching idea that explains a lot of our politics. And so even when we're looking at things like voter suppression or the fact that we can actually countenance a policy in this country and people will defend separating infants from their parents, something that is indefensible under any circumstance. But the only way that we can actually allow that to happen is if in some way we think that this person's relationship with their child is fundamentally different than my relationship with my child or my neighbor's relationship with her child or his child. And that unwillingness to grant the same degree of humanity to people whom you don't know, who maybe live in a different part of the country, or who worship differently than you, or have a different racial, ethnic background than you do, that unwillingness to do that has metastasized. And it's at the root of so many of the problematic things that we see now.
I think also, Jelani, you're a historian, and you've probably heard this before. This is something from W.E.B. Du Bois, the sociologist in the 1890s, that has always stood with me. And Du Bois here is describing how difficult, he says, the most difficult social problem in the matter of Negro health is the peculiar attitude of the nation toward the well-being of the race. But this is the part about what was stuck with me. He says, there have been, for instance, fewer other cases in the history of civilized people where human suffering has been viewed with such peculiar indifference. The indifference to me is where the lack of empathy comes in, and I'm not understanding where that's coming from. Where do you think, Javier, in your work, you mentioned you're an immigrant to the country. Have you seen that indifference get stronger as being a Latino and being an immigrant in the United States?
I don't think it matters who the president is. As an immigrant, I've always felt the indifference towards immigrants. Even Obama, he's still the deporter-in-chief. He has deported more people than Trump still. And I will take it a step further and all the way back. Isn't this indifference part of what America was founded on in the country? This idea of the other, and that we are coming in here and the other, we cannot exist and we cannot imagine the other as part of ourselves.
You were nodding your head, Ziwe. You think that
America exists on the idea of the other. Yes, this is in the fabric of who we are as a country. We started with free labor, and being indifferent to human beings and treating them like property. So that's what this country is.
Can I say one thing really quickly? One of the things I think that's absolutely true, as a historian, that is absolutely fundamentally true. The thing that I lament and that concerns me is that we have had, almost like the stock market, a rising and falling level of empathetic understanding. And so you have the institution of slavery, and you have people who understand that there has to be abolitionism. Or that you have labor exploitation, you understand that people have said that we have to have an 8-hour workday, or we have to abolish child labor, or any of the things that the best things that have happened in this country have been a product of the triumph of this democratic sense of empathy. And so that's what I'm talking about when I say that this moment is driven by this absence. It's that we know that we're capable of this, or that the best of us. James Baldwin said that the world is held together by the love of a shockingly small number of people, and that we know what that small number of people have been capable of doing. So this is not just the only option, that the institution that begins, the country that begins with the institution of slavery is doomed to always be what it once was.
And I also want to bring up the issue of language here, right? Because language has played a really important role in, I think, this othering, Javier, that you're referring to. I'm thinking here, and I want to play a clip from David Livingston Smith. He's a professor of philosophy and the author of the book Less Than Human. And we interviewed Professor Smith around the time that President Trump had used what we would consider to be dehumanizing language to talk about whether it's MS-13 or other Latino immigrants. Let's take a listen.
Racialization arises out of conflict, exploitation, and oppression of human groups. So built into this sort of racial language are implicit ideas of superiority and inferiority. When you dehumanize people, you just push them one step further out of the category of the human entirely and into the twilight zone of subhumanity.
What do you think about that, Javier, in terms of your work and your lived experience?
I completely agree with it, and what Jelani was saying too. I feel like communication is also a part of the lack of empathy that we're having, and we're not listening to each other. And I'm wondering about how the news media is playing now. We have like all technology, and it used to be like we can listen to one thing. And now we have a lot of different things. So to bring it back to that, I'm just hearing how even in the New York Times, and I've been doing some research regarding this, the images of children and their moms, we always only concentrate on the poor children and the mothers. But what about the fathers? What about the adults? And what about when the kid becomes an adult? Do we not care about that kid anymore? So there's like even other levels of dehumanization, even regarding the dehumanized.
And Ziwe, and I want to get into this in the next section, we're going to have to take a break soon, but you've also talked about how trauma is connected to your family and in leaving Nigeria.
Certainly. Yeah. My parents are Nigerian immigrants. They came from Nigeria after the Biafra War, which was a civil war. My grandmother starved to death in her village. And so it's wild that I'm an artist and a comedian because the trauma is so heavy. And I still feel that in my interaction with my parents now. You know, they have post-traumatic stress, but they'd never seek help for that because that's not the culture. So that actually deals a lot with how I have empathy. Because I see my parents through this Americanized lens. And so I'm able to read about immigrants and feel related, like this could have been me if circumstances were different. Yeah. And so that's how I'm able to make art, is through the lens of all this trauma that my parents suffered at the hands of colonization.
Jelani, Javier, and Ziwe, stick with us. We're going to have to take a quick break. We are broadcasting The Takeaway live from WNYC's The Green Space today on the 1-year anniversary of my show. More of our conversation on empathy coming up. Stick around. We're back, broadcasting The Takeaway live from the Green Space in New York City at WNYC, and I've got Jelani Cobb of The New Yorker alongside poet Javier Zamora and comedian Ziwe Fumudoh. Thank you guys for being with us on this excellent show so far. We're talking about empathy, and in talking about empathy, I might have mentioned this, Jelani, last week. I feel like in the United States, we focus a lot on us, right? And we do us really well. It's all about me, 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 but we don't do us really well. And what I'm doing for y'all that don't see me is the collective sort of signal here, the rest of us. How damaging has that been? I mean, I know we like to do us, but are we losing sight of this bigger collective? Ziwe, what do you think?
Certainly. I think you see that with the art that is made. If the people at the top look a certain way, certain artists don't get to have their voices heard. So that definitely hurts the us. And if people don't have their voices heard, well, then you can't really see your voice reflected on television or movies or theater. So that hurts empathy.
And how do you make that work in your work? Because you do almost the opposite of what a lot of folks here do. You're looking at the funny side of things. You're trying to make people laugh, but is there empathy involved in that?
Laughing, yes. I think that comedy connects people, and being able to laugh two different people being able to laugh at the same thing is just like, okay, well, we have something in common. So with my comedy, I race bait. Well, I do lots of different things.
You want to give them an example? You want to race bait me? I'll play along.
Okay, sure. Have you ever dated a black man?
Yes.
Wow, that's weird to objectify.
But I'm
Horrible.
Puerto Rican, so does that count?
No, it doesn't. Love is love is love.
That's right.
The words of Lin-Manuel.
Exactly.
But yeah, I like to race bait because people feel so uncomfortable about race, and to discuss this is just a healing process, and we really need to heal as a nation.
I want to talk a little bit about also, we're seeing in the news, we see a lot of moments, I guess, for empathy. And I want to bring up a couple of things that I think are newsworthy. The measles outbreak, for example. Are we showing empathy when we think about the way, there are some folks who say, don't vaccinate your kids. Other folks, we now have one of the highest outbreaks of measles in the United States in decades. Is this a lack of empathy? What's happening at the southern border, for example, is that a lack of empathy? Is that a lack of collective empathy? Is that a lack of empathy just from the administration? Notre Dame. Right? Burns. And there's so much going into Notre Dame, but does that mean there's a lack of empathy elsewhere? I'd love to open that up to the panel. Anyone wants to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think it's one, we know, like people working in media know that there's this very, it's an odd dynamic in which people can relate to a story or they can't. And sometimes it's geography, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's something that reaches out and grabs a person. Sometimes it doesn't. But I do think that there's been almost a kind of callousness, and going back to the point of what you said about being very me oriented, that, and I'm sorry to keep going back to the president, but I think it's just so well,
he's the
instructive
president.
about so many things. One of the things I think has been most disturbing was, his tendency to ridicule people who've made great sacrifices on the behalf of others. And I think that diminishes the possibility of service. It's almost like he treats people who suffer on the behalf of others as if they're suckers. And that was what I saw as the connection when he insulted John Lewis, the congressman from Atlanta, from Georgia, who very famously was bludgeoned nearly to death on Bloody Sunday in pursuit of the Voting Rights Act. And he also habitually, even posthumously, ridiculed John McCain. And so John McCain and John Lewis are very different people, but the thread that did tie them together was their willingness to suffer on behalf of others. And this is a person who said that he made no sacrifices. He couldn't point to anything he'd ever sacrificed in the interest of someone else. I think that is not maybe the cause, but I think it is exemplary of this bigger idea of how much we respect and how much we are able to honor the idea that there are things more important than our personal gratification.
What does that do to us as a society? What does that do to us as Americans? That seeing that all the way from the top, because I do think it matters, right? What's all the way at the top and how that trickles down. Not to suggest that it doesn't, grow from the bottom up as well. But I'm just curious, Javier, what do you think that does for us as a society?
Well, I did mention that, Obama and Trump, it doesn't really matter, but now I'm taking it back because it does matter.
They're different.
It definitely does matter because Obama would never blatantly said or did the things that Trump says. And as an immigrant, I still have undocumented people in my family. And the switch of the rhetoric that this president just blurts out now, my family is more scared than they were when Obama was president. So I feel like it's that fear of not being free. As an undocumented person, you never feel free completely, but it's even worse now. It's heightened. They go to work and they don't know if ICE is gonna show up. And now it's like an even heightened fear. The fear was already there. The fear has been there already, but now it's like increased.
So we've got about a minute left in the segment, and I do want us to think about some positives here. At the same time, as I was putting together this segment, I thought, well, we have seen some empathy, right? We are seeing some movement forward when it comes to gender equality, when it comes to racial equality, when it comes to even people that set up GoFundMe accounts, right? And there are people that say, I can't pay my rent, and suddenly their rent is paid. That indicates empathy to me in some some way, shape, or form. We got about a minute left, less than a minute left in this segment. Are we going to be all right? Ziwe.
We're doomed.
We're doomed. Javier, are we going to be all right?
If we're able to imagine and create and maybe get into art, yes, we will be.
I think if we're willing to be brave and willing to follow the best examples in our history, then yes, we will be.
You heard it here, folks. Jelani Cobb is a staff writer for The New Yorker who writes about race, politics, history, and culture. Ziwe Fumudoh is a comedian and writer for Showtime's Desus and Mero, and Javier Zamora is a poet and writer born in El Salvador and author of the collection Unaccompanied. Thanks to you all for this time.